I would like to welcome you to online intake, the what's and the whys of online intake. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Claudia Johnson, today's moderator.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Please chat us as we're doing this presentation if you have comments or things that you want us to cover. We're going to leave some time at the end to cover some additional questions and have more discussion. So if we don't answer on the chat, do not despair. We will try to get to you. So, Jillian, can we slide to the why intake? Why are we focusing on intake? Actually, let me introduce the panel. We really are joined today by very experienced and expert people in the field of legal nonprofit technology, and they will introduce themselves, but I really think that this is a panel of who is who in areas related to on intake, online intake, and the use of technology for effective advocacy in legal services. So very happy to have Bob Aubin, Breckie Hayes-Snow, and Joan Kleinberg, Ed Marks, and I will be your moderator. Before we jump into the specific presentations, I wanted to do a little overview of why we're talking about intake. And so if we slide to the next slide. Basically, some takeaways that we hope you get from this presentation is we're going to review in detail two projects, one from New Hampshire and the Northwest Justice Project portal, online intake portal. So those will be our two case studies. And then Bob Aubin will look at, from a technology perspective, he's a developer and he's worked with many, many states on online intake applications. He will share his thoughts on the technical pieces of an online intake project, kind of really break it down. And then at the end, we're going to wrap up with Ed Marks, who is going to be joining us and sharing with us a project where he's aggregated intake data from a lot of different programs in New Mexico and sharing that. So that's going to get to the why question. Why do we care about intake? So intake is probably one of the most energy and time-consuming activities a legal nonprofit does. So that's one of the reasons we're focusing on it. I have seen it anywhere from having it been budgeted at around 10% of total resources. But when you really go and you start looking into a program and seeing all the intake-related activities, oftentimes more resources than what's on the budget get allocated to it. So one of the really good reasons to look at intake and looking at how do you insert technology into it is to see if you can somehow make it more effective. The other thing about intake that is really important is that really intake, whatever cases you end up accepting for full representation or for unbundled or for whatever type of level of legal assistance you will do, will really impact the legal practice of your lawyers and the type of program your program is. So getting intake right for your program and your community according to your board mission standards, it's very important because it will define the type of cases that you litigate. So those are the two main reasons to really focus on intake and thinking about how improving it. There are other things that intake's done that is very important, like determine the posture of the case, determine deadlines, determine ability to serve, etc. In terms of defining intake for purposes of this presentation, that's the next slide. Really, intake is really focused on one thing, and really what it aims to answer is, do you, the applicant, qualify for this specific problem and for whatever specific type of services we offer? And that's what intake tends to be all about. And generally, the answers are going to be yes or no. And if it's yes, there's going to be a protocol to tell you exactly what type of service, what you have to do, how the case is going to be handled, with whom, etc. If the answer is no, then you look for resources and a way to send the person to our other providers that may offer that particular type of service, and if not, send them to self-help or some other sort of triage. So that's what intake is defined as. There are different types of intakes, and this is all probably review for all of you. There's walk-in intake, which generally happens in areas where there are large number of eligible clients, so there's an office component and a density of applicants that walk in. These are traditional type intake methods, and they're very valid in some areas. There are hotline intake lines, and those have been around since the late 90s. And in hotline intakes, and we're not talking about hotline intake here, a large percentage of the applicants get turned around. Online intake, which is what we're focusing on today, and it's what we're going to delve into, it's starting to mature. It has been going on, I would say, since around 2011. A lot of the projects that we will share here have been funded by TIG, but not necessarily. Other funders are funding online intake projects, including senior hotlines and also some local funders. So we will talk a little bit about that. And then other things that sound like intake, a group by intake, and are not intake, but just to put them out there because people may have heard about them, it is the concept of triage, the concept of an expert system, and then something that is new and up and coming is the concept of checklists of self-assessment tools where people can check their issue out and get a sense of what they need to do. Those could come before intake or after intake, and they're really emerging, but we won't focus much on these non-intake type activities. So moving on to rules and standards, intake is a regulated field. It's not something that doesn't have rules and standards, and I'm just going to kind of say that because you will notice commonalities, and the commonalities are based on that. Basically, there's LSC regulations and letters. If you're an LSC-funded program, you would definitely want to look at that. There are ABA standards that apply. Some of them apply to all legal services providers, and these are the 2006 ABA standards. There are ABA hotline standards that came in 2001. So you want to look at that if you're somehow combining online intake with your hotline. And then there are model rules of professional conduct that incorporated technology into how a legal program communicates with a client around technology. So those are some that you definitely want to check out. And then you may have your local rules, and then you may have your local agency program case acceptance standards, your own board policies and procedures, and your own grievance protocols. So all of these things are kind of the rules that will impact intake. In terms of the context and factors and incentives is, a lot of people, a lot of programs need to do more with less. So it's an issue of keeping costs down and maximizing the yield of eligible clients of cases you want to take. And the other one is, the factor that internet is open 24/7. So if we look at internet coverage, it has changed a lot. If we go to the next slide, Jillian. If we look at broadband coverage and traditional, the next slide, traditional cable, if we flip and we look now at wireless and other types of ways to connect, for the next slide, you can see the difference. It's more and more and more available. So, the issue of connectivity is really something that has significantly improved. In terms of online intake, there are really no ABA standards on online intake yet, but the new model rules may apply, so you definitely want to check them out, particularly the competency standard. I don't know if your state is going to adopt them or not, but putting them out there. And then in terms of online intake, is Legal Services Corporation does have a requirement for human verification to check false negatives and false positives, and also requires that the grievance process apply to online intake. A lot of this is because if you look at the rules under LSC, the definitions of household and the expenses and all of that are not in plain English. They're very complex. They're not necessarily easy for a regular person. So the human verification is to make sure that the applicant understood those because they're not normal definitions of household, what lay people would define as a household. So just very quickly, the model rule of competency that I mentioned is that it does require now in the commentary that lawyers learn and have the skill and the ability to look and consider, keep abreast of the benefits and risk associated with relevant technology. So that is a big change for all of us as attorneys. And the LSC Program Letter, I already mentioned that it's the human verification requirement and the reason behind that. On the pros of online intake, if we, I talked about the 24/7 and all that. I think that one of the pros of online intake is that you are basically letting the applicant do a lot of their data entry, saving some time for your staff in terms of that. The other thing about online intake is that it's neutral. It doesn't discriminate on race or accent or, national origin or anything like that. It's an application that's going to work the same way for the people that answer the questions in the same way, and that's really nice. It can be used from anywhere, so there's a location factor. You don't have to have an office. You don't have to be paying rent somewhere to make yourself available to that client community in a rural area or in a suburban area that has a lot of poverty, so that's very cost effective. And the other thing is that some programs have successfully used it to open up intake in other languages. So Spanish and some other languages, you can make your intake available without having to have staff in-house, so it reduces the need to staff it. You do have to invest in the translation and plain language of that. So the speakers will get a little bit more into the factors of online intake. So basically, you're going to need to have a stable and really well-defined case acceptance guidelines to program into an online intake application. And all of the people that will receive these cases, from the online intake, will need to have a common, solid understanding of what type of cases get accepted by problem time. The other thing is that your program will need to have, either through consultants or internally, a strong IT team. And Bob Aubin is going to get a little bit more into that. There's going to be transfers, XML, a lot of CMS modifications, a lot of technical things that may need to happen to support an online intake application. So I let Bob cover more of that. So in terms of examples of online intake, one of the first states that rolled out with online intake was Ohio. And you can take a look at the online intake interview that they created and then shared with a lot of the communities. So this one is kind of a model that has been replicated in other states. And they have it in English and in Spanish. And so if you want to look at kind of a very, what would we call it, a seminal example, that would be one. The other one that has been out for about 2 years, and we have featured in some of these other LSNTAP calls about online intake, is the Utah one. And this interview does a really good job with domestic violence, with victims of crime on the eligibility process for LSC services, and how it counts resources for victims. And they handle the human verification through a secure chat. So that's a very good model. It gives you some ideas on where you can go with this. Other states have done online intake, in Florida, in Detroit, in Texas, in Pennsylvania, and then Northwest Justice Project doing the portal. And so now we'll transition to Joan Kleinberg at NJP, who will talk more about the NJP online intake portal concept and the project.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm going to talk a little bit about our project and how we developed it, taking a bit of a scattershot approach here. Next slide. So when approaching a project like this, there are three main things that you have to do to get this going. First, you've got to be really clear on what your goals are. And maybe I say this because at NJP, our goals were perhaps different from goals at other programs, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The second piece is developing your logic model. And the logic model is basically the branching logic that you're going to use that would take the user from one question to the next question to the next, depending on what the answer to the question is, and ultimately gets that person to your desired endpoint. And then finally, you have to develop the user interface, which is the user's experience in terms of what he or she is reading and seeing on the screen, and what that person is getting at the end of the process. Next slide. So Claudia said when she was speaking about intake that the intake that you do determines the work that you do. And at NJP, when we were thinking about creating an online portal, we had some very specific goals. We had made as a program a strategic decision to reduce the volume of family law that we were doing. And that's not why we developed the online portal, but when we were developing it, it was in our mind that we wanted to make sure that people who had pressing problems in the benefits area and the housing area that were time limited had a way to get in. We have a statewide hotline, Clear. It is constantly overwhelmed. And sometimes, to be honest, it creates a barrier because when people are trying to call, they can't always get through. And we were worried that people who had a 3-day notice or a 10-day notice from a landlord or who had gotten a notice from the Department of Social and Health Services, we wanted to make sure that they had a way to reach us in a timely way so that we could give them effective help. At the same time, using our online portal only for benefits and housing cases supported the strategic decision to make sure that we were doing plenty of work in the benefits and housing areas. So when we set this up, we basically set it up so that people with benefits or problems or people who had threatened loss of housing would be able to complete an application, and at the end of that process are given a choice of either calling the hotline or of having us call them. And that way they could bypass any of the barriers that the phone system might be throwing up. At the same time, we wanted to provide a triage tool so that people who didn't need to call or shouldn't be calling because we weren't going to be able to help them would not call and and create these bottlenecks on our phone line. And finally, we wanted to be able to provide resources to people who, either people who we couldn't help or even to those who we would be able to help, but it might take some time before they could connect with us. And so they would have good information from our LawHelp site in the interim. Okay, next slide. So this is what our logic model looks like. And as you can see, what you're doing is kind of chasing each question and answer out to a conclusion. This is one page of a document that kind of filled a whole wall when we printed it out and taped it all together and posted it up there. We named it the Starship Enterprise because it kind of had that same shape when it was all up there visually. But it ultimately, for each question and answer, it allowed us to say, go to this next question or deliver this information. Next slide. You're handling a lot of information when you're developing the logic model. There are a lot of questions, a lot of answers, a lot of information or messages that you're pushing to the user. There's help text that you've got to keep track of that's connected to each question. And so you really need to start out with a system to be able to track all of that. We put it all in a spreadsheet, and we would have been completely lost if we hadn't had that. Next slide, please. So in the course of developing an online intake project, there are policy decisions that you're going to have to make. And some of it has to do with what information you're comfortable gathering online, to what extent and how will you make allowances for the user maybe not completely understanding the question, or somehow giving you incorrect information, and how will you handle the LSC requirement that you have to notify all applicants of the grievance process. So we made some decisions. We decided not to ask for any citizenship information in the online application, and that is handled by our screeners when they speak with somebody. On the financial eligibility piece, we decided to set the limit at 300% of the federal poverty level, which we know is higher than LSC eligibility rules, but we didn't want to turn away somebody who might be eligible because there was a misunderstanding about who to include in the household. And I will say that that question of how to articulate the questions for who to include in the household for us was one of the thorniest parts of developing the logic model. And I think we three of us spent weeks trying to figure out how to get to that question of how to present the household concept. So just in case extra people were included or not enough children, we just decided to use 300% as the threshold. The messages that we deliver say, it looks like you may be eligible, we'll have to confirm, and so our screeners then do the final financial eligibility determination. We push the grievance message on the online system, so all users of the system do see that a grievance process is available. Some programs do conflicts checking. We don't ask for information about the opposing party for two reasons. One is because we do have screeners doing the final screening. Also, in Washington State, we have Rule 6.5, which does allow us to provide some service to both parties where there's a conflict. So that was less important to us than it might be to people in another state. Next slide. So we use the A2J interface. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what it looks like. One of the challenges in developing an online intake system is breaking what you need to know down into very simple questions with very clear answers. And it took us quite a few iterations to really break it down into small enough bits of information that you can ask a question and get a clear answer. We also used the help text function to try to anticipate what questions people might have or where things might be unclear, and then use the learn more area to be able to answer questions we thought people. Next slide. So in our online application, just to kind of give you the background on it, we basically go through the system. If it's a benefits or loss of housing case, we offer the opportunity for us to call. So we categorize the application says you call or we call. If it's benefits or loss of housing, typically people ask us to call them, and those are cases where we will call. If we have not in the course of the triage determined that it's a problem that we don't handle, then we get to the point where we say, it looks like you may have a problem that we handle and that you may be eligible. You're still going to have to call us, but you may complete this application. And if you do, when you call us, the screening conversation will be shorter because we'll already have all of this information. And so people can continue on through and complete the application, and then our screeners can pull up the application, and all they have to do is confirm information rather than from the start. One of the benefits we find is that the applicant has entered their own name and spelled it correctly, and that's pretty helpful. So 68% are likely eligible. They break down 1783 in terms of whether it's a we call or a you call. The other 32% are either cases where somebody didn't complete the application or didn't give us enough information to really be able to know what to do with the application. And others are, we can tell. I see that someone's having a hard time hearing me. I'm talking right into my phone. I'll try and speak louder and hope that's better. Last year, a little over 15,000 people used our online system, and a bit over 10,000 of those completed and got to the point where we could tell if it was a you call or a we call. My math suggests that about 2,800 were diverted away from calling us. Either we said, this isn't something that we handle, or you're not financially eligible, or you have an out-of-state legal problem. It's not a guarantee that they didn't go ahead and call us, but it would have been our hope that they didn't. But even in many of those cases, if we had information about the legal problem, we would have at the end of their application or at the point at which they were exiting, we would have tried to push relevant materials from our LawHelp site or links to other agencies that might be helpful to them. Next slide, please. So when I looked at these 15,000 applications that we got over the past year, to the extent that we had information about them, they were less racially diverse than the people who called our line, who were not online applicants. They were very, very much younger. The incidence of seniors using the online application was relatively low, more females, but income distribution was about the same. So that's what we saw in our demographics. And next slide. So I would say, looking back at our experience, I think the things that I'd like to impart to people are define your goals right up front. Decide if you want all applications or certain ones. We had a huge fear also, if we had opened it up to all applications, that we would not have the staff to handle them, either the screener staff or the advocate staff. If you are going to open it up wide, plan ahead because you may have additional volume that you need to deal with. We had a user survey connected to ours, and it's important to read the surveys. We did use the information we got in the surveys to make some changes. One of the things that we got from the surveys was early on was that people weren't clear that even if they completed an application, they might still have to call the hotline. And so we put that information in at several points before they started, at the end, in the middle, just really made sure that that message was delivered in lots of ways. We also learned that it's really important to make sure that your own staff understands how this works, because they may be talking about it in the community, and so it's important that they understand why you're doing it and how the process works. We had to go back through outreach materials and put in information about the process, again being very clear what the two options at the end of it were. And finally, just plan a lot of time. We couldn't believe how long it took us to do the branch logic and to structure all of the questions. So that's it from us.
Okay. Thank you, Joan. There were some questions about whether your application is available in languages other than English.
It is. Oh.
Go ahead.
It is. It's currently not. We would like to do a parallel process in Spanish, but we just haven't gotten around to that yet.
Okay. So we are going to now transition to Breckie Hayes, from New Hampshire Legal Aid. Breckie?
Hi, can you all hear me?
Hi.
So I'm Breckie Hayes Snow. I'm the Deputy Director at the Legal Advice and Referral Center in Concord, New Hampshire. We're a statewide legal aid program, primarily a hotline. I know there's a PowerPoint which has some slides for me, which I assume is going to be part of what's available after the presentation. I'm actually going to depart from that because I was more interested in showing people what we have than just showing them the slides. I'm going to start off by just sort of giving you a brief outline of how we got to where we are. We started talking about doing some kind of online intake probably around 2005 or 6, and we talked and never were able to pull it together to get anything started. We don't have any in-house IT. Anybody? I'm a lawyer, a supervising attorney who's just been here forever. That's why I became the deputy director. So actually implementing anything was going to be a huge project for us. We're one of 3 programs in our state. We all work pretty closely together to provide services. In the fall of 2009, we had a total failure of our phone system. It crashed. So all of a sudden we had no access. We have sort of an emergency phone line that's our one copper line that comes into the building. So we ended up having to route all of our phone calls through Google Talk and then call people back using the one landline. It was a nightmare. And in the course of a matter of maybe 2 or 3 days, Carolyn Robinson, the wizard from Massachusetts, put up a very sort of rudimentary online intake system for us so we could provide some access because our phones were down. And it only took a few days to get a new phone system in place, but that crisis really pushed us into going with online intake. I've got our statewide website open because I just wanted to show you on our Spanish side, we still have the original version of our online intake system. I don't speak a word of Spanish, so any complaints about this, I'm happy to forward on to the people who do around here, but it's not me. And as you can see, this is just a basic form. An applicant fills it out. and when they hit submit, we receive an email with this information. Very low tech in the online intake world. And it basically just provided us some basic information about the client and the ability to call them back. It required that our staff do all the intake data entry manually, which they were real troopers about, but it was not our grand vision for online intake. In 2012, we started working with one of our partner programs in New Hampshire to develop a new online intake system. We looked at what was available, and at sort of the last minute, we ended up going to the system that was made available through Legal Server, which is the case management system which we already had. This is now the first page of the online intake that we have in New Hampshire. The system was made available at, I have to say, pretty remarkably low cost. We got a small grant from the New Hampshire Bar Foundation for about $4,000. We got some in-kind donation from PSTI. We spent a lot of our own time and energy, but the out-of-pocket expense to develop this was pretty minimal. We started the project of developing this system it was in November. I'm pretty sure it was shortly before Thanksgiving, and we went live with it on, I think it was March 31st. So it was a pretty quick process. That's not to say it didn't take a lot of hours, but in the grand scheme of things, we were pretty pleased with our ability to turn it around so quickly. In 2013, the New Hampshire Bar Association's Pro Bono program moved to Legal Server as their case management system. New Hampshire Legal Assistants already had it. So as of now, we have all three of the primary legal aid programs in the state with the same case management system, and a fourth iteration of Legal Server in state, which is our online intake. It is a standalone case management system. It's its own database, which allows applications to be submitted there and then electronically transferred to the appropriate program. One of our goals was to maximize our ability to integrate how intake worked for the three programs. We're all statewide programs, but it's a pretty small state with pretty limited staff and resources. I hope you can hear me. I've been seeing pop-up messages from people that they're struggling. So let me know if I need to speak up. Right now, we are still in the process of sort of completing our vision for how intake is going to be integrated between the programs. We are going, hopefully within the next, well, before the end of the year, but hopefully within the next 2 months, we will be having the appropriate cases transferred directly from the online intake system to New Hampshire Legal Assistants, and shortly thereafter implement the same system with the Bar Association's Pro Bono program. The way we've done it thus far is that the applications that are submitted come to LARC, and I will show you our case management system, electronic case transfer file, which shows pending files. And I'm going to quickly, before I disclose much information, go to a test. And when we receive a file from the online intake system, we get this pending case page. And by opening it, we are allowed to then run a conflict search. And had I entered income when I did this test, it would show the annual income and the percentage of poverty. And the adverse party, and if there are family members entered in the online intake, those also would show at the same time, which allows us to do all the conflict searches before we actually import the file to our database. That way, if we find we have a direct conflict, we can, rather than begin new intake down here, we can reject the file and it never imports. What we do if that's the case, because we have email and address and phone numbers, we're able to contact the applicant and tell them why they're a conflict or that they're wildly over income. We have what we refer to as our form responses, which are letters that we've drafted on a handful of subjects which would cause us to reject a file. So, for example, a conflict, perhaps somebody who submitted an application but they're looking for an attorney to help them with a criminal matter, somebody who appears to be wildly over income. And using this page, we're allowed to email or mail the person a letter explaining that we can't help them, which is a great time saver for the staff. And it also allows us to provide in writing all of the appropriate referrals for those applicants. So even though we can't help them, we can provide them with a lot of information about the services that might be available for their problem. Eventually, these pending cases will go to New Hampshire Legal Assistance and Pro Bono also, so they won't have to come through us and then be transferred to the other programs. What we have found, I think the most startling thing which we found when we went to an online intake system was that the number of applications, if you will, that we were able to process pretty much doubled. When I look back over all of the numbers, I can show you this particular chart, and the little brown line shows the applications processed, both the accepted and rejected. And this only goes back, I think, to 2008 or 2009. I've done the numbers back to 2007, and this range continues back into our history, and it continues at this level. I know it's messy, but it's by month, and we're so small. Every time somebody takes a vacation, it has a huge impact on our overall numbers. But we did find that we were able to essentially double the number of applications that we processed, which we think is just a tremendous benefit to our client community, because even though the percentage of rejected files has stayed steady as we've gone up with numbers, all of those people who are rejected are receiving some materials from us with referrals to the appropriate programs or to other services or other human services programs, or the list goes on and on and on. So that's been our I guess our biggest benefit to our community. And I can tell you that we have not had an increase of staff that went along with that increase in numbers. We have had changes in the way that we handle our caseload internally, which may have had an impact also. But the real huge change here back in 2009 was the implementation of online intake. So we're really proud of our system. Final word would really be to reiterate some of the things that Joan said. Plan, plan, plan. If I could go back and do it again, there are things that I would do differently. But figuring out exactly what you need to know and how to ask the questions is the tricky part. We did go with the legal server version in part because we use the case management system, and we knew that we would be able to make the modifications to the system in-house without further technical training. As I said, we don't have an IT person on staff, so it's just me. And using the skill that I had already developed in managing our case management system, I've been able to manage our online intake system, to build new questionnaires, to add interviews on new substantive areas, to make changes to the system without having to bring in a programmer or a technical person to do that for us, which for our program was really important.
So is the built-in legal server tool optimized for mobile?
Yes, I've had that conversation with Ivy Ashton, and when I go online and look at it on my phone, yes.
Okay, very impressive. Very impressive also to see that the advice hours doubled. So that's actually, thank you for sharing
Right.
that.
Well, and I think that a lot of that is because the online intake it allows the processing of so many applications much faster. You know, so then instead of spending that extra time having otherwise people who would be doing case handling having to spend the time on that piece, they're able to focus their energies on providing advice.
Okay, well, thank you, Breckie. We will transition now to Bob Aubin. Bob, go ahead and introduce yourself and take it on more from your perspective as a developer, somebody that's worked with a lot of programs on building these tools.
Okay, will do. My name is Bob Aubin. I'm a developer, an A2J, Hot Docs, and Neologic developer, also the president of Northcom Associates. And I'm going to be talking about my perspective on creating, most specifically, A2J intake interviews. I view a typical A2J intake configuration to be made up of three logical components: the web server, the A2J interview and supporting server files, and the case management system. Each is provided and managed by a different vendor or entity. Strict rules apply in the back end in the form of a schema, which specifies how the resultant XML data will be imported or read, used by the case management system. The strict rules also apply to answer formats in the XML in the form of number rounding, codes used as substitution for long answers, date formatting, and notes fields like case notes or income notes or asset notes, which are multi-line text fields that have to be formatted in a specific manner. Someone must orchestrate how these three components work together, and that usually falls on the developer, I've found, because the web server people don't know from A2J or the case management system, and the CMS folks want to concentrate on the CMS. They're not interested in A2J. So next I'm going to talk about each of the three components. Logically, in the middle, I see A2J, not just the interview, but the supporting server files, in Flash and PHP. The Flash runs the interview, of course, in the browser, and there's an important PHP file on the server that is modified by the developer, like me, to control what happens when the interview is completed. There's also a transformation file written in XSLT, or Extensible Style Sheet Language Transformation, that in effect converts the A2J answer file into XML for use by the case management system. So the developer would create the A2J interview, modify the PHP files, and also write the transformation file. Up front is the web server. Now I'm showing two logical components here, but in fact it's one physical component because A2J runs on a web server. Now this web server could be in-house, or it could be leased or rented from an ISP like AT&T or Comcast or a small ISP down the street. At a minimum, you need the following services working on the web server. PHP servers, of course, or the A2J PHP server files won't work. You need SSL to secure the interview because the applicant will be entering sensitive or private information into the interview. And there's write permissions. A few months ago, I wouldn't even have thought of this, but something bit us because one of my clients had a rented server, and the level of service did not allow the creation or saving of files on the server. So when we uploaded everything, we couldn't save any XML. And we found that was because they didn't have write permissions on the hard drive. Of course, you need write permissions. And optionally, if you want to send email at the end of an interview, you need the SendMail service running on the server. The A2J PHP files can be modified to send email to the applicant, for instance, saying, we received your interview and someone will be calling you, yada, yada. You can also send email to your offices based on the area of law or maybe where the applicant is located. If you want to send email around, you need SendMail working on the server. On the back end is the case management system, of course. Now, this could be running on the web server, or it could be running on a different server altogether located elsewhere. And if it's on a different server, you have an added complication because A2J and the PHP files and transform create the XML file on the web server. And there's no way A2J or the web server is going to get that XML file over to the case management system. Somehow the case management system has to import that. And I've not seen many good techniques for doing this. We've talked about using FTP, running on a schedule and whatnot. Nobody is too crazy about that. I'm going to be working with PICA. They have, in the near future, they have an API that supposedly automatically gets the XML encrypted and over to the case management system. I don't quite understand how that's going to work. I'm dying to find out. And then Kemp's, and I'll be talking about this later, Kemp's has come up with an innovative way of doing it, and I'll be describing that uses a web page for getting the answer file over to the case management system. Now, these case management systems are all different. They, no two are alike. They use different schema. Although a schema is supposed to be a standard, there really is no standard. One was proposed, I think it was in 2003, but it was never adopted. And everybody's schema seems to be just a little bit different. The schema dictates the elements and the variables to be included in the XML, what their name should be, and where they're going to be located in the XML file. Some of the schema standards are flexible so that if there's nothing in the schema that can accommodate the particular field that you want to enter, you can create a custom field. We did a lot of that in Iowa with PICA. But there's other case management system that is strict, and we just, if it's not in the schema, there's no way to enter it. We have a client who wanted to ask a question, are you homeless, yes or no? But there's nowhere in the schema to accommodate the answer, so we can't use that. It's too bad. So this is a modified version of a screenshot that I glommed from the A2J site, and it shows how a system is packaged. The server is denoted by the solid blue line. It shows all the services that it composes it. So let me show you this. Right here, the interview would come in via SSL. A2J is running on the server along with Flash. And when you click the Submit button, that fires off the PHP file, sends the answer file through the transform to create the XML. And that XML is then imported into the case management system. Now, I'm showing the case management system surrounded by a dotted line because, again, it may or may not be on the same server as A2J. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. What does the transformation file do? Also known as the transform. Well, it converts and it formats the A2J answer file to the XML. It'll do math and rounding. It'll round to 2 decimal places and no decimal places, depending on which case management system you have and what they need. It'll map the A2J variables to the case management system fields, and I'll show you an example of that later on. It can also create full names from the individual names and full addresses. It can reformat dates. Now, here's a little known thing. The A2J date format adheres to the hot doc standard because, well, A2J answer files are used to create hot docs documents. And the hot docs date format is day, month, year. So today's date would be 20/8/2014. Case management systems typically want to see month, day, year. So if you try to enter a raw A2J date into a case management system, it'll get rejected. The transform can also do things like enter state abbreviations, which are typically needed in the XML file. In the interview, you ask for the entire state name, but that has to be converted to an abbreviation. And it'll do these notes fields, compiling and formatting. An example of this is income notes. Some systems can have 4 different types of users: self, spouse, children, and other household adults. And they can have multiple employment. Could be wages, could be salary. And what the case management system needs is an annual figure for each party and a total. So the XSLT will do that. Now, everything I said here, except for the date reformatting, can be done in A2J. But trust me, it's a lot easier to do it in the transformation file. What do the A2J PHP server files do? Well, that maps, it tells the answer file where the transform is, so that the answer file is run up against the transform to create the XML, which is then named according to the way you want it. In one system, we use today's date, which would be Wednesday, August 20th, 2014, followed by the applicant's name, followed by the county that the applicant is in. That is all in the XML file name, so they can easily identify that applicant's XML file in the holding tank. The PHP file can also save and name a backup of an answer file, and this is proven useful because sometimes XML files somehow get lost. So I'll get a call that they can't find the file, I'll find a corresponding answer file, run it through the transform, and recreate the XML for them. The PHP files can also redirect the user to different web pages when the interview is done, depending on if they've been kicked out, what area of law they have, what county they're in, depending on what web page you want to see them. That can all be processed through the PHP to show a different web page at the end. You can also keep track of different types of kickouts. I have some clients with about 8 different types of kickouts. The applicant could be a minor, maybe they don't live in the state, or they don't live in the right county. So when they get kicked out of the interview, the PHP file will create a comma-delimited file, like a spreadsheet, and put it in an appropriate folder. There won't be a whole lot of data in that file because we may not even have the applicant's name at that point. But we'll know that in a given month, say, 8 people were kicked out because they were represented by an attorney or because they were minors. And they can use that information to make an appropriate decision. Some of my A2J interviews also have surveys at the end where I turn off the A2J navigation so that once they're in it, they have to keep answering the questions and clicking continue. There's no way out of it. We capture that survey information and put it in a separate spreadsheet, as opposed to putting it in the XML file. So I create both an XML file and a spreadsheet with survey information that you can view to get the data that you want to get out of it. And finally, the PHP can cause the email to be sent, and as I've described earlier, either to the applicant or to an office or both. Earlier, I mentioned the Kemp's Caseworks doesn't use the transformation file. They created a feature called the A2J Interview Direct Import. So, again, I'm showing the picture from the A2J website. But in lieu of having a transformation file, they use a web page right here so that when the user clicks on Submit, the PHP server file processes the answer file through the web page, and the web page sends the data over to the holding tank. And this works rather nicely for them. But there is no transformation file. And when you have an intake with no transformation, you're sending the raw data from the answer file to the case management system. So you don't have any rounding, abbreviations, formatting. All that stuff must be done in A2J because there is no transformation. And dates are problematic. because, as I mentioned earlier, A2J, for some reason, well, hot docs, for some reason, the date format is day, month, year, and that just won't be accepted by the Kemp's casework. So when we implemented this for a client who had been using a transform, they couldn't import anything because all the dates were being rejected. Let me show you a little bit more about that. So here is a typical date variable in an interview. And you can see, surrounded by the red block there, that the format is month, day, year in the question. But under the covers, it's converted to day, month, year. What we had to do to get around it was to do away with the date variable and use 3 multiple choice drop-down variables, one for month, one for day, one for year, to create the month, day, year format that was acceptable by the case management system. But this also required lots of extra code because we had to format these 3 answers into a date and then test the date to validate it to make sure that it wasn't February 31st, for instance. And conversely, that February 29th would be accepted for leap years. So we can do that, but it takes a lot more code. To give you an example of what the process is like, these are just 2 lines, 2 entries from an A2J answer file. In the red are the A2J variables, and blue are the answers to those variables, first name and last name. When that gets over to the transformation file, the transform is telling XML, look, I want you to create an element named first name, and to populate that with the value from the applicant name first TE, which is coming from the interview. That's how you map the stuff. And as it ends up in the XML, you can see it creates the element first name with the value Sally and last name with Jones. And you do that line by line by line for all the variables that you need, all the fields that you need in the case management system. Okay, so these are some of the things that you have to provide to the developer if you're going to be offering an A2J intake interview. The variable, the field map. First name to first name, that's pretty clear, but things like, well, here's an example of marital status. You have the choices typically of single, divorced, married, and widowed. And if you select married in the interview, the word married will be the answer. But what the case management system needs is the code M. So something has to convert that. Again, you can do it in A2J or in the transfer. A little more cryptically, one system will convert the problem area of law government benefits to 153. That's what has to end up in the XML. And another example is, the primary language, English, and we use the ISO standard 2-letter abbreviation if the schema will allow the ISO standards. You have to check. You have to verify all of these things in all the schema. So you have to tell me what variables and fields do you need, what can the schema accommodate, and the two don't always jive. There may be some trade-offs. If, depending on the case management company, you might be able to use custom fields, as we did with PICA. We did that a lot in Iowa. But in others, they're strict, and there's no modification. You get what's in the schema, and that's it. You also have to determine what else you need and want. You want to track the kickouts. You want to compile survey information in the spreadsheet. You want to send email. You want to redirect. You want to redirect to a bunch of different pages at the end of the interview. How do you want to name the answer files and the XML files? And how do you want to handle things like poverty guidelines? How is that going to affect the interview? Where's the case management system? Is it co-located with the web server? That's the best thing. But if it's not, you get the added complication. It's beyond me to solve that because A2J can't handle it. And I'm often brought in at the end. So we've got the case management system, we got the web server. Let's get the A2J guy in here. And that's when they discover that, whoa, man, we just can't get that XML over to the case management system. So think about it beforehand. So in summary, I see an A2J intake system being made up of 3 logical components, all of which need orchestration to make it work together. To make it work, you have to define your wants and needs, provide me with a valid and up-to-date schema. And one last point is, if you want to do an A2J intake interview, it's restricted to A2J version 4 for now. I know 5 was introduced earlier this month, but I've had an email exchange with John Mayer, and the server files for 5 are not ready yet. He said that it'll work pretty much the same as A2J version 4 does with PHP, and they may have additional technologies available such as JavaScript and .NET. So that's my view. That's the way I see it. And Ed, if you're ready, you want to take over? Just click the button, and I'll give you control.
Thank you, Bob. So now we're going to transition to sharing data and using the data to coordinate between multiple programs. I know that in some states, online intake applications are shared, like Breckie said, and that's one model. I know that there are other states that have done similar sharing models. Ed is going to share a data sharing application that he's built for New Mexico programs, and that they're using to stay coordinated on systemic advocacy and looking at trends and things like that. So this is part of the why, and Bob just shared a little bit on the what of intake. So Ed?
So there was also a quick question for the two different programs that have implemented online intake. Were either of the programs able to track if online intake increased geographic diversity or any other demographic diversity? Is it a different group of clients compared to your average clients who come through like your hotline?
This is Joan. I can say that our telephone hotline has pretty much always tracked the poverty population statewide. In other words, our calls come in surprisingly close to the ratio for people as they're distributed in the 39 counties across our state. I actually haven't looked at the online, though. It's an interesting question, and no doubt I'll be doing that after the webinar.
Well, I know we're getting to the end of the time, so I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can, but I'm happy to answer any questions. What we've done in New Mexico, we have 5 partner agencies along with New Mexico Legal Aid that are using PICA as their case management system. So we started out with that group to make it easier to solve some of the technology issues. But what you're about to see, we intend to grow out and evolve so that people using other case management systems can participate as well. What it does, it takes non-confidential data from all the agencies participating and puts it up every night onto a web server a web service that PICA developed. It uses an algorithm method to look at what the baseline is for that problem type over the past 30 days compared to looking at data from the past 3 years as well. If there's a spike that goes high or low above a certain threshold, it will display an alert graph. So this one that you're seeing on the screen right now tells you, for example, of all the data collected by all these partner agencies, that for some reason there was a spike in people asking for adoption assistance recently, and now it seems to be taking a decline back down. Usually adoption applications are very low, but this one said, hey, wait a minute, for some reason people are calling in about adoption now. So then we'll take steps I'll show you in a moment to figure out whether there's something going on that we can do anything about or not. Another example on the screen that you're seeing now, it shows that compared to the data that we've had over the past 3 years, that we've had our second highest spike in domestic violence case applications at about 60 per day statewide. That's the second highest spike over the past 3 years, and so we have to start asking questions, what's going on there? The graph below that shows a similar result for consumer finance cases, that we had a spike over the past couple of months as well for people calling in for that issue, and we have to start looking and drilling down to see what's going on there. The whole theory behind this, and this was funded by an LSC TIC grant, the whole theory behind this is that we'll see patterns in the aggregate data if we get samples large enough from what's going through everyone's intake systems. And if we see it early enough in the process, again, this is loading, refreshing the whole combined database every night. It runs at like 2 in the morning overnight to give us an update from what came in the day before. So the theory is if we see these patterns and can figure out what they mean early enough in the process, then we're going to have a much better chance to do something more effective, either individually within our own organizations or collectively as a coalition. So once we see these alert graphs, this just tells us something's going on. It could be coincidence. It could be that there's some particular cause for it. It could just be the normal ebb and flow of certain case types. So the next thing we do is click on one of these graphs and try to drill down to a screen that lets us filter by a set of data that we have all agreed was non-confidential, that we could all share without having to worry about any confidentiality issues. And we were very conservative in this first phase. I think probably as this evolves, we'll be adding more data here and more data filters. But in the beginning, we were very conservative. The State Bar had some input on this. They, for example, raised concerns about whether we should share opposing party data without asking the client's permission. So you'll see on the column down toward the bottom right that a lot of the opposing party data is not there because we're still having staff training issues about making sure everyone documents that we have asked the client's permission to share that data before we post it here. But otherwise, we can filter by location, we can filter zip code or county, we can filter age groups, we can filter for disability status, for race and ethnicity, for gender. And we start looking at what's going on here. Is this peak in the number of people asking for help with this particular type of problem? Is it clustering in a particular county? So if we scroll down through the data that's shown on this screen here, and we saw that half of the new cases were coming from Doña County, where Las Cruces is in southern New Mexico, then we would get people together to say, well, what's going on here? Is there something in the community that's driving this? Is there some particular bad actor down there that's driving this? And what should we do to increase the response we give to these folks who are calling in? Another example of the data screen here shows just filtering the results by gender, and we've often found in New Mexico anyway how shocking it is for many of these applications how disproportionate the number of women callers is that we're getting compared to the number of male callers. So when we pop up the chat window here, a question just flew by. This is tracking everything that people, the question was, is this tracking requests for service or cases actually accepted? And the answer is that this tracks everything coming in, whether we accept the case or not. And let me give you an example of why we thought that was important to do it that way. Car repo cases in New Mexico, there's an awful lot of them. There's too many for us to respond individually case by case. But many times in the past, what car repo applicants would get would be a quick piece of advice by somebody on the hotline, or it would be a brochure or a form letter, just something that they could do self-help. Sort of a one-size-fits-all response. But early on when we started running this data system, we found that in one particular county, there was a high correlation between the demographic factors and the zip code factors for people who were getting evicted, matched up pretty well with the correlations for people who were applying for help with car repos. So now we're rethinking in that county our approach to car repo cases, that we're learning it actually may be one of the most effective ways to reduce the eviction rate in that county. To not wait until the person loses their car to car repo, then can't get to work, and then can't pay the rent, and then gets the eviction notice. We can go further upstream and start trying to deal with some of the particular bad actors in that county who are running the car deals in ways that inevitably leads to a repo. So we thought it was very important to get the aggregate data up front, whether we actually accept the case or not. We're still seeing these factors where the clusters are and where the patterns are for different problem types for people who are coming to us for help with those types of cases. I hope that answered the question. And what we're doing now in this next stage, first, this last slide that I'm showing here, what we're doing now in this next stage is trying to figure out how to better interpret what the data means. And we put a feature in here, if you're a participating organization, you can click on cases that came from or originated with your own organization. You can see the actual PICA file. It will jump you right to the PICA file to drill down for details. That one agency can't see another agency's files. We still have the confidentiality issues to worry about. But we're trying to figure out what methods work best. Everything from monthly webinars to ad hoc phone calls to sharing email information, so that we can try to figure out not only what do the patterns mean, but what are we going to do about responding to the patterns, especially collectively as a group. And that's one of the struggles that we're having right now. We think the technology is working very well, but we're having a bit of a challenge how to staff this so that the same people are looking at the same data in similar ways, so they understand over the course of time what it means, what we've seen in the past, what we're seeing now, what we might predict we'll see in the next week or the month or quarter to come. So we're at that phase now where we have a system that gives us very good handle on the aggregate data, but we don't know exactly what the outcomes are and the results, and whether we're getting better outcomes at the back end of accepting the cases compared to what we've done in the past. We think we have a much better handle on what the data is telling us that we should be doing, but we still have to go to the next phase of this to make sure that we're getting better outcomes and results for the client. That's essentially where we are right now. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ed. I think it's really interesting, the capacity that online intake and sharing intake data, the capacity that it can provide a group of legal aid attorneys who want to be more proactive in terms of systemic advocacy or looking for trends. So I do hope that people look again at your slides and the trends. Just a question or maybe a comment. So the issue right now is more trying to get people to create a core group of users that can get familiar with the data that's coming in, so that everybody kind of has a baseline. Is that where the project is now and where some of the challenges are coming in?
And somebody who has more time freed up to spend time analyzing the data, because you can look at these graphs and you can look at the data filters, and again, you don't know right away whether it's coincidence or there's some other cause for why one problem spikes or declines. We need somebody who can understand the ongoing flow of how all these problems come through and how they interconnect with each other, so we can decide, yes, there's a correlation. We can point to a particular bad landlord, for example, that we then need to target all the cases that come in for that landlord, or we can figure out that something in a particular county was caused because of a major employer going out of business. It's those kinds of issues. We need somebody who's spending enough time with this to have those kinds of external context factors high on their radar.
Or maybe even connecting it to other public data sources, right? Like filings or court filings or things like that.
Right. We do have. We've already started some preliminary discussions with our court data folks here to see if we can build toward that. We are optimistic, but that may take a year or two or three before we even get a prototype for that.
It looks like we also have a question from Rochelle. Actually, this is for Joan. Her question was, what percentage of your intakes have used online?
So what percentage of our total intakes come from online? I actually don't think I have that number immediately available. It's a relative. Oh, go ahead.
I can put you in touch too if you want to. We can add that into the slides afterwards, or I can put you in touch with the person who asked that too.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Any other last questions? I got some questions about the human verification earlier on. I posted the CFR. Actually, I just see that LSC just updated the CFR for the eligibility rules, but that doesn't include the human verification. The human verification was in a it was in a program letter, and there was a feedback period. Jeff may know more about this through the technology group of NLADA. There was a process where LSC requested feedback on that, and I don't think that they released a different letter after that. So the latest version of it that I have seen is called Program Letter 12/1, and I can go see if I can dig it back out of the lsc.gov, but it's gotta be it's there, and it has the language on the human verification. But I can email it to folks who are looking for it. I think Sharon is asking for it. But the CFR hasn't changed. The actual rules haven't changed. It was all kind of more agency administrative law type stuff. Okay. Any other questions or comments or things that people would like us to forward or post?
Yeah, when we find that, please feel free to post it to the LSTAP listserv, and we will also include it in our blog post summary.
Yeah.
I'm having trouble finding it myself. Google is failing me.
Well, just wanted to, it looks like there's one more question, actually, before we close out and tell you about some other LSNTAP webinars. Looks like Alexis asked Ed what type of data analysis tool is used by New Mexico.
I'm not quite I mean, this is all built as a custom application, so I'd have to ask Aaron Worley how to answer your question precisely. I'm not quite sure how to answer it here.
So you're not using an external tool like Crystal or something. It's just data analytics built into the system.
It is. He customized it based on what the committee doing this project told us we wanted him to do. We certainly use Crystal reports to help interpret and further add to some of the results with the internal data we have that we don't share with the other organizations. But these screens that you're seeing was something custom built by PICA.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to all the speakers and to Pro Bono Net for putting this on, and to LSC for the funding to put these on. The survey is posted in the chat. If you have any feedback, we greatly appreciate that as we use it both for our future bids on these and for deciding what content to put forward. We've got several webinars still coming up this year. The next one is a new one that we have not done in the past. It is on OneNote and how to use OneNote, which is free with Microsoft's Office suite. We have the extremely popular and backed by popular demand 50 tech tips coming up that week also. And then we have using mobile phones for service delivery at the end of next month. So we've actually got 3 webinars coming up here in a little bit over 30 days. And we look forward to seeing people at them. So please send us your feedback and look for those future webinars coming up.